A man decides he wants to change his life. He sets goals. He makes plans. He announces his intentions to everyone who will listen. He posts about his transformation. He talks about the person he's becoming, and nothing changes. The weeks pass, the months pass, and he finds himself in the same patterns, the same frustrations, the same fundamental problems wearing different masks. He wonders why his determination isn't enough, why his desire to change seems to evaporate the moment he stops talking about it. What he doesn't understand is that he's trying to transform while remaining fully visible. He's attempting to rebuild himself while still performing for an audience. He's seeking to master his own mind while it remains scattered across 1,000 external validations, opinions, and distractions. And this is impossible. You cannot change your life in the same environment that shaped the person you're trying to stop being. Real transformation requires disappearance, not escape, not avoidance, but a deliberate withdrawal from the noise, the attention, the constant demand to be seen and validated and engaged. A return to silence, a return to yourself. This is not comfortable, it is not celebrated, but it is essential. And if you're searching for a truth that goes deeper than surface motivation, then stay. What follows is not entertainment. It is reflection. It is confrontation. It is the quiet work that precedes every meaningful change. The Stoics understood something that modern culture has forgotten. They understood that the mind cannot strengthen itself while constantly exposed to external forces. That wisdom cannot develop in the marketplace. That character cannot be forged while performing for spectators. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome with every reason to remain visible and engaged, wrote his most profound thoughts in private. Seneca, advisor to emperors, periodically withdrew from public life to examine his own mind. Epictetus taught that the wise person guards their attention as carefully as a fortress guards its gates. They knew what we have forgotten. Visibility weakens, constant engagement scatters, the need for external validation enslaves. And transformation only becomes possible when a person withdraws from these forces long enough to remember who they are beneath the performance. Consider what happens to the mind in constant visibility. It begins to orient itself around external feedback. Every thought becomes filtered through the question of how it will be received. Every action becomes calculated for its effect on reputation. The internal voice, the one that knows what is true, what matters, what must change, grows quieter with each performance until it can barely be heard at all. The person becomes a collection of reactions to others rather than a coherent self directing its own existence. This is not living, this is responding. And you cannot transform your life by responding to external forces. You can only transform it by withdrawing long enough to remember what you actually want, what you actually believe, what you actually are when no one is watching. The difference between disappearing and running away must be understood clearly. Running away is driven by fear, by the desire to escape discomfort or responsibility. It is reactive, chaotic, desperate. Disappearance, as the Stoics practiced it, is different. It is strategic withdrawal. It is the deliberate choice to step back from external demands in order to strengthen the internal foundation. It is not permanent isolation, but temporary retreat for the purpose of return. Return as someone stronger, clearer, more complete. When Seneca withdrew to his estates, he did so to examine his life, to read, to think, to separate his own judgments from the chaos of Roman political life. He returned with clarity. When Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations, he was not performing philosophy for others. He was working on himself in private, building the internal discipline that would allow him to rule with wisdom. The withdrawal created the space for transformation that constant engagement could never provide. Most people fear this kind of disappearance. They fear that if they step back, they will be forgotten. that if they stop performing, they will cease to matter, that if they withdraw from constant visibility, they will lose their place in the social hierarchy they've worked to establish. And this fear keeps them trapped. Trapped in patterns that don't serve them. Trapped in relationships that drain them. Trapped in a version of themselves that was built for external approval rather than internal integrity. But what actually happens when a person disappears? When they stop posting, stop explaining, stop seeking validation and attention? At first, there is discomfort. The mind, accustomed to constant stimulation and feedback, rebels against the silence. It generates anxiety, restlessness, the urge to re-engage. This is withdrawal in the literal sense, the nervous system adjusting to the absence of its habitual stimulation. Then something shifts. The noise begins to clear, the constant static of other people's opinions, expectations, and judgments starts to fade. And in that clearing, something emerges that has been buried under all the performance, the actual self. Not the self that was constructed for others, but the one that exists independent of their gaze, the one that knows what it actually wants, the one that can perceive truth without the distortion of reputation management. This is where transformation becomes possible, not in the noise, not in the constant engagement, but in this quiet space where a person can finally see clearly, where they can ask themselves hard questions without immediately performing the answers for an audience, where they can acknowledge uncomfortable truths without worrying about how those truths will be judged, where they can begin the difficult work of changing not just their circumstances, but their fundamental orientation to life. Epictetus taught his students that the beginning of philosophy is the recognition of one's own weakness and incapacity. But this recognition cannot happen while a person is performing strength for others. It requires solitude. It requires the courage to stop pretending and start examining. It requires disappearance from the constant demand to appear capable, together, successful. The modern world makes this increasingly difficult. Every platform, every device, every social structure is designed to keep people visible and engaged. The algorithms reward constant output. The culture celebrates those who never stop, never withdraw, never disappear. But what is being created by this constant visibility? Not depth, not wisdom, not character, just performance. Just the appearance of transformation without its substance. Watch what happens to people who attempt to change their lives while remaining fully engaged in the systems that shaped them. They adopt new habits but maintain the same relationships that reinforce old patterns. They set new goals but continue seeking validation from the same sources that made them dependent. They talk about becoming different but remain in the same environment, exposed to the same influences, performing for the same audience. And the fundamental transformation never occurs because the conditions that created the original problem remain unchanged. This is why disappearance is not optional for those who genuinely want to change. It is not a luxury for the privileged or indulgence for the weak. It is a necessity. A strategic recognition that you cannot become someone new while remaining fully embedded in the context that created who you currently are. What does this disappearance look like in practice? It looks like stepping back from social media, not permanently, but long enough to remember what your own thoughts sound like without the constant feedback loop. It looks like spending time alone without filling every moment with consumption. No podcasts, no music, no constant input. Just silence, just your own mind. It looks like saying no to social obligations that don't serve your transformation, even when saying no means disappointing people or appearing antisocial. It looks like creating space, physical space, temporal space, mental space, space where the old patterns cannot follow you, space where the external voices cannot reach you. Space where you can finally hear the internal voice that has been trying to guide you but has been drowned out by all the noise. The Stoics called this the inner citadel, a fortress within the mind that external circumstances cannot penetrate. But this citadel cannot be built while under constant siege from external demands. It requires withdrawal. It requires the time and space to fortify the walls, to clarify the principles, to strengthen the foundation. And only after this work is done in silence can a person return to the world without being immediately overwhelmed and scattered by it. Marcus Aurelius understood that the quality of one's life depends on the quality of one's thoughts. But thoughts cannot be refined while constantly interrupted and influenced by external forces. They require cultivation. They require examination. They require the kind of sustained attention that is only possible in withdrawal from distraction. He wrote that the person who is not disturbed by external events has achieved something rare: freedom. But this freedom is not granted by circumstances. It is built through practice, through the repeated choice to withdraw attention from what cannot be controlled and direct it toward what can: one's own judgments, one's own reactions, one's own character. This is what changes when a person disappears. Not their circumstances, at least not immediately. What changes is their relationship to their circumstances. What changes is their capacity to perceive clearly without the distortion of external pressure. What changes is their ability to act from internal principle rather than external expectation. And these changes, these internal transformations, eventually manifest as external transformation. But the internal must come first. And the internal requires solitude. There is a reason that every major spiritual and philosophical tradition includes periods of withdrawal. The Desert Fathers, the Buddhist retreat, the Stoics' private study. These are not escapes from life, but preparations for life. Times when the person steps back from the world to strengthen their capacity to engage with it wisely. Modern culture has largely abandoned this understanding. The assumption now is that constant engagement is optimal, that visibility equals relevance, that stepping back is stepping down. But this assumption is destroying people's capacity for genuine transformation. Because transformation is not a public performance, it is private work that eventually produces public results. Consider what happens in nature. A seed must be buried in darkness before it can grow. A caterpillar must disappear into the cocoon before emerging as something new. The transformation happens in the hidden space, not in the visible one. And yet we expect human transformation to occur while remaining fully visible, fully engaged, fully exposed to the same conditions that created the need for transformation in the first place. This expectation is irrational, and meeting it is impossible. So the question becomes, are you willing to disappear? Are you willing to step back from the validation, the attention, the constant feedback loop that keeps you tethered to your current state? Are you willing to spend time alone with yourself without distraction, without performance, without the comfortable numbness of constant engagement? This is not comfortable. The mind will resist. It will generate reasons why now is not the time, why you need to maintain visibility, why stepping back is irresponsible or self-indulgent or impossible given your circumstances. These are the mind's defenses against change. They are the voices that keep you trapped in patterns that no longer serve you. But if you can push through this resistance, if you can create the space for genuine withdrawal, even when every force is pulling you toward constant engagement, something remarkable becomes possible. The clarity returns. The internal voice, long drowned out by external noise, becomes audible again. The principles that should guide your life, obscured by the constant demand to respond to others, become visible once more. And in that clarity, transformation begins, not the performed transformation of social media posts and public declarations, but the real transformation, the kind that changes not just what you do, but who you are. The kind that rebuilds the foundation rather than rearranging the furniture. The kind that lasts because it comes from internal conviction rather than external pressure. Seneca wrote that we should set aside certain days on which we shall be content with the least expensive food, with rough clothing, asking ourselves, is this the condition I feared? But this practice is not about testing deprivation. It is about withdrawing from comfort long enough to remember that you do not need everything you think you need, that you are not as fragile as the comfortable life has led you to believe, that you can survive and even thrive with less stimulation, less validation, less constant engagement. This understanding that you are sufficient in yourself, that you do not require constant external input to maintain your sense of self, is liberating, but it can only be discovered in disappearance. In the withdrawal from all the things you've come to believe are necessary, in the silence where you confront yourself without distraction. The process is not quick. You do not disappear for a weekend and emerge transformed, but you begin. You create the first space of genuine solitude. You experience the first moments of clarity that come when the noise stops. You hear your own thoughts without the constant interference of external voices, and you realize that this quiet space, this return to yourself, is what you've been missing. This is what makes transformation possible. From this space, the work begins. The work of examining your life honestly, of identifying the patterns that no longer serve you, of recognizing the attachments that keep you trapped, of clarifying the principles that should guide you, of building the character that allows you to live according to those principles regardless of external circumstances. This work cannot be done in public. It cannot be done while performing. It cannot be done while seeking validation. It requires disappearance. It requires the courage to step back from the world long enough to remember who you are and who you could become. And when you return, because the disappearance is temporary, strategic, purposeful, you return different. Not because you've announced a transformation, not because you've performed change for an audience, but because you've done the hidden work, the internal work, the work that actually matters. You return with clarity about what you want and what you do not want, with principles that guide you rather than opinions that sway you, with the capacity to act from internal conviction rather than external pressure, with the strength to maintain your course even when others judge or question or misunderstand. This is what the Stoics meant by self-mastery, not control over external events. That is impossible, but control over your own mind, your own reactions, your own character. And this control, this genuine self-mastery, is only built in solitude, in the disappearance from external forces that allows internal forces to finally organize themselves according to reason rather than reaction. So if you want to change your life, truly change it, not just rearrange its surface, you must be willing to disappear, to step back, to create space, to spend time with yourself in genuine solitude without the constant distraction of validation and visibility. This is not the exciting part of transformation. It is not the part that makes for compelling stories or inspiring posts, but it is the essential part, the foundation upon which everything else is built. The world will not celebrate your disappearance. It may not even notice it, and that is precisely the point. This work is not for the world's approval. It is for your transformation. And transformation, real transformation, is always an inside job. It happens in the hidden spaces, in the quiet moments, in the deliberate withdrawal from noise and distraction and constant engagement. You do not change your life until you disappear. until you create the space where change becomes possible, until you step back from the performance long enough to remember what you're actually performing for, until you withdraw from external validation long enough to build internal conviction. This is the path, not easy, not celebrated, but essential, and waiting for you whenever you're ready to take it, whenever you're willing to disappear. The question is, are you ready? Are you ready to step back, to create space, to spend time in genuine solitude working on yourself without an audience? If so, then begin, not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, now, today. With whatever small withdrawal you can manage, turn off the devices, decline the invitations, create the space. And in that space, start the work that only you can do. The work of becoming who you're capable of being. The transformation is waiting, but it requires your disappearance first. Everything else follows from there.